Now, let's go to growth assumptions. Let's say based on your research, the future plans of the company are the same as their historical experience. Okay. So one assumption is that the historical growth rate would be the same growth rate that you will apply to the company. When do we usually assume the same historical growth rate and the same forecasted growth rate? Most likely, if the company is already at the mature stage, then you can apply the same historical growth rate to your forecast. Okay. So how do we usually estimate or determine the historical growth rate? One is you simply use the arithmetic mean. So if, let's say, you have these values, year 1, 2, 3, 4, then the growth rate between years 1 and 2 is 20%. The growth rate between years 2 and 3 is 8.33%. And the growth rate for year 4 is 7.69%. The arithmetic mean is simply the sum of these three, 36.02, divided by 3. So you can apply a growth rate of 12.01% if you base it on the arithmetic mean. If you're going to use the geometric mean, of course, you have to add 1 to your historical growth rates, okay? Then multiply all three, okay? Or if you're using Excel, simply apply the GeoMean formula. But don't forget to deduct 1 at the end, because remember, we added 1 to our growth rates when we're computing for the geometric mean. If you use the GeoMean formula in Excel, or you compute it on your own, you should get a historical growth rate based on the geometric mean of 11.87%. In this example, the arithmetic mean and the geometric mean are not that different, 12 and 11.87%. So probably you can use a 12% historical growth rate for this example. Another alternative, especially if you're using a constant growth formula for your model in your forecast, is to determine the sustainable growth rate. So how do we get the sustainable growth rate again? The sustainable growth rate is the retention ratio or the flowback ratio times the return on equity. So just by looking at the formula, we know that the factors affecting this would include the accounting policies of the company, their dividend policy, and of course, their level of earnings. We have discussed in previous sessions the different levers of performance and their analysis, or even in previous subjects, you've also discussed this. Using a three-way DuPont, for example, ROE is affected by the profit margin, asset turnover, and financial leverage. We call these three the levers of performance. So some may use the sustainable growth rate as an assumed constant growth rate, unless, based on your research, there are some adjustments to the plans and prospects of the company. Then you have to apply a different growth assumption. Now, we mentioned at the start that you can have no growth or constant growth. For example, if we're looking at a mature firm, okay, mature firm is usually associated with a highly competitive environment. And if it is already mature, then you have limited expansion opportunities. Most of the time, these firms would also have a high dividend payout and modest growth in their free cash flows. Some of them may even have no growth, but most likely you can apply a constant growth rate, but the growth rate is modest or low if you're analyzing a mature firm. Most of the time, a successful firm would evolve over time. So from startup to a growth stage to maturity, And of course, there is a possibility of its demise. This suggests that the cash flows will not grow in a smooth progression. So our alternative then is to apply the third assumption. We have to construct a multi-stage cash flow model that mirrors the performance of the business as it goes through the various life stages. Start, growth, maturity. Okay, so those will represent the various stages of growth of the company. Remember that when we discussed industry structure last week, we also look at the industry life cycle. Then you have to consider that when you develop your own assumption for the growth stages of your company. Since the near future is generally easier to predict, then we have a more detailed forecast for the first stage if we have a multi-stage growth. That's why I require you to prepare a 5-year forecast, because some of you would most likely have a good basis to predict the next 5 years. So that could be prepared in with much detail. But the subsequent stages, say the second stage or even a third stage, or even more than 3 for some of you, those subsequent stages are usually constant growth models, okay, with growth rates that vary from one stage to the next. And the most popular of these multi-stage growth models are the 2-stage and the 3-stage growth models. Of course, as we mentioned at the start of our valuation discussion, the problem with analyzing our enterprise and valuing it is that we have an indeterminate life, given that it is a growing concern. So one way to address that is to assume a perpetual constant growth in the terminal stage. The value of that last stage, or the value of the cash flows representing that last stage, is sometimes called the terminal value. Okay? So when do we usually have constant growth? Okay? The mature stage of the firm is usually considered the last or terminal stage if we have a multi-stage valuation model. Let's say we have 3 assumptions. One is no growth. In a no growth assumption, we have constant dividends of 40 centavos per share, and the relevant cost of equity is 15%. Second, we have constant growth. We assume that the growth of the company is similar to the growth of the economy, and the company has a stable dividend policy. The dividends now is 40 centavos per share. The cost of equity is still 15%, but now let's assume there is a constant growth similar to the growth of the economy of 15%. This is just an example. The third assumption is, what if we have a multi-stage growth? Let's say 2-stage. You have a supernormal stage with a growth of 12%, a very high 12% growth rate. But after the supernormal stage, after the first 5 years, then it would normalize, or it would have stable growth of 5%. So how do we compute for an estimate of the intrinsic price given various growth assumptions? Let's start with the no growth assumption. So we simply apply the perpetuity formula, the perpetuity with no growth. To estimate the intrinsic price, we have the constant cash flow, dividends of 40 centavos per year, and simply divide it by the cost of equity of 15%. So using a no growth assumption, our intrinsic price is 2.67 pesos per share. That's simply the perpetuity formula, the basic perpetuity formula. What if we have constant growth? Then we apply the perpetuity with growth formula. The perpetuity with growth formula is cash flow 1. This is not cash flow 0. Cash flow 1 or sub 1, or in this case dividends 1, is the expected dividends, not the present or actual dividends, divided by the difference between the cost of equity and the assumed constant growth. So in our example, D0 is 0.4. That's the actual dividends. To get the expected or forecasted dividends for year 1, we multiply it by 1 plus the growth rate of 5%. So that will give us dividend 1. And divide it by the difference between the 15% cost of equity and the 5% constant growth. So our estimate will now be higher, 4.2%. So we can say that the difference between 4.2 and 2.67 represents the present value of growth opportunities. Without growth, it is 2.67. But with 5% growth, we now have 4.2. The difference is the effect of the growth opportunities of the company. So it's as simple as that. You may remember this from previous courses. Now, what if we have a multi-stage growth? In our example, 12% first stage, 5% for the stable or constant growth, the terminal stage. In that case, we can identify 2 stages. The first stage, the first 5 years, dividends will grow by a higher growth rate of 12%. But after that, it will grow by its constant growth of 5%. Okay, so how do we get the intrinsic price? This is just simple time value of money calculations. Okay, we have to keep that in mind, that our computational procedure is very simple. What is really hard is researching on the assumptions that we can use in our subject companies. But the computations, these are all straightforward time value of money applications. So if dividends now is 40 cents times 12%, dividend 1 is 40.448 centavos. Times 12%, dividend 2 is 50.18 centavos. Times 12%, for dividend 3 is 56.2 centavos. Applying the same dividend, the same 12% growth rate to dividend to year 4, that's 62.94 centavos. And for year 5, again, assuming a 12% growth rate, that is 70.49 centavos. Okay. All of those first 5 years, we can already get the present value. How? By simply dividing it by 1 plus the cost of equity for year 1. And of course, 1 plus the cost of equity squared for year 2 and so on. For D5, it's 1 plus the cost of equity to the 5th, okay, representing year 5. How then do we represent the terminal or second stage, the constant growth stage? Okay. First, we have to estimate dividends for year 6. So how do we estimate dividends for year 6? Dividends for year 6 is dividends for year 5 times 1.05, the constant growth formula. Okay? So that represents dividends for year 6. What then is the terminal value representing all cash flows beyond year 5? we apply the constant growth formula. Okay? So this is D6 divided by the cost of equity minus the constant growth rate of 5%. But remember that this represents the terminal value at year 5. Why? Because the constant growth formula uses the expected dividend. So if we're looking at time 5, the expected dividends is dividend 6. Similar to when we use the constant growth formula here, this is like the value at the start. The expected dividends is D1, not D0. So here, the expected dividends is D6, not D5, if we're considering time value 5. Okay. So this is our terminal, or time, not time value, but terminal value 5, sorry. So if this is terminal value 5, we discount this by dividing it by 1 plus the cost of equity raised to the 5th. Okay? So D6 is 0.7402 or 74.02 cents divided by our cost of equity minus the 5% growth rate, we get the terminal value at time 5, 7.4. Okay? Then we discount it to the present. Discounting it by dividing it by 1 plus the cost of equity raised to the 5. That gives us 3.68. So adding all present values, our estimated intrinsic price is 5.53. Of course, that is higher than 4.2 and definitely much higher than 2.67. Again, the difference between 5.53 and 2.67 is the present value of growth opportunities. The difference is wider because at the start we have 5 years as our supernormal growth phase. Okay. Now, this is not exactly applicable to all, but most of the time, this would be the result of our valuation. The total price is 5.53, but you would see that much of the value would come from the terminal or constant growth phase. Out of the 5.53, the share of the terminal value at year 5, present value of that is 3.68. So much would come from the constant growth phase. Because honestly, it represents a longer part of the company's life. This represents 5 years, but of course, we have a supernormal growth at those 5 years. But we can say that for this example, the impact is greater for the constant growth phase. Okay, but these first 5 years are also important. Why? Because this may be the source of the upside for the company. Okay, the initial stage probably represents their immediate plans. Okay, and that is the source of upside. It could be a possible source of upside. So when we look at our two-stage model, especially when we do this in Excel, we just apply the growth rate for every estimate of dividends for the relevant time periods. And we simply get their present value by dividing them by the relevant cost of equity. Now, there are shortcuts. You may use these shortcuts, but in Excel, you don't need to use the shortcut because you can simply project year by year. So what are examples of these shortcuts? Okay. This formula, this one, is the same as this formula. Simplified. But I'm sure you won't use this formula on the screen when you do it in Excel. You just use our example. Why are they the same? This is the same two-stage dividend discount model. This represents the present value of the terminal value. Dn plus 1 divided by Ke minus Gn is the terminal value divided by 1 plus the cost of equity raised to n. That's how you get the present value of the terminal value. Well, the first term represents the present value of the dividends for the extraordinary growth phase. Do you have to memorize that? No. You just have to apply this in Excel. Okay? The extraordinary growth in the first stage may be due to a high return on invested capital. Why? Why do we have an extraordinary growth phase? Let's say the company is the first mover in the industry. So the supernormal growth is due to their first mover advantage. Or there are barriers to entry. They have exclusive rights during the first years. That's why you have a high return on invested capital. And or this may also be due to a high investment rate at this stage. Let's say driven by a rapidly expanding industry or sector during the first phase. Are there limitations to the use of this model? One, how do you define the length of the extraordinary growth stage? In theory, the duration of the growth phase can be linked to product life cycles, product opportunities, and the timing of entry of competitors. But in practice, it will be difficult to quantify the time frame. That is the challenge for all groups. Second, the model assumes an abrupt shift from high to stable growth. From 12, it immediately falls down to 5% between years 5 and 6. So a more gradual shift may be realistic. As I mentioned, a significant component of the present value comes from the terminal phase. As in the single constant growth model, the value is sensitive to assumptions about the stable growth phase, the last phase, or the second one if we have two stages. So how do we address some of these limitations? Let's say for number 2. Some use a two-stage H model. So when we say we have a H model, here we assume a steady decline in the growth rate. So this is not 12%, then it falls down to 5%. So this is 12%, which slowly falls to 5%. Okay? Again, if you're using Excel, you just forecast each year. Okay? But that forecast can be represented by this formula. Okay. So this formula, again, considers this first term is the present value of the terminal value. DO1 plus GN, that's the growth rate at the end of 2H. Okay, 2H is the duration of the extraordinary growth stage. So DO times 1 plus GN divided by KE minus GN is essentially the terminal value, okay? Plus the second term representing the present value of the years where you have a declining growth. Okay. Or you can use a three-stage model. Here you have a high stable growth, then you gradually decline for the second stage, then you have the stable or mature phase with a constant growth. That is again represented by the formula here. As I've been emphasizing, do you apply this formula if you're in Excel? You just use a forecast of each year. High stable growth for the first phase, assume declining growth for each year in Excel, and then apply the terminal phase. Okay? So these are just some examples on how you, on various growth assumptions that you can use. Okay? Remember that in the examples we've just discussed, we're using dividends as a proxy for the cash flows. Okay? Dividends here represent the free cash flows to the equity holder because that is what they usually receive. Dividends are the cash flows received by common stockholders. But what we're really after are the free cash flows available to these common stockholders. So there's an alternative to the dividend discount model. We call that the free cash flow to equity model. So when do we use the free cash flow to equity model? One, if there is a struggle for corporate control. Why? You cannot rely on dividends if there is a ongoing struggle for corporate control. Why? Because present management may be declaring, issuing, and paying a high dividend, a very, very high dividends, or they may be using a very high dividend payout because they fear that they would eventually be eased out of the firm. So they're getting their returns already by getting a higher dividends. So in that case, you cannot rely on dividends, use free cash flow to equity. In effect, the free cash flow to equity is the residual cash flow left over given operating earnings and after considering investment and financing policy. So again, what is free from the point of view of a common shareholder? To answer that, what is not free? One, those that are already set aside for the investment plans and policies of the company, they're not free. What are those? Your capital expenditures and your working capital needs. Second, those set aside to satisfy other claimants, okay, or other sources of financing, particularly creditors and preferred stockholders, are also not free. So you have to deduct preferred dividends. That is not free from the point of view of the common shareholder because that should be paid to the preferred shareholder. And the required principal repayments to creditors. That is not free because the company should stick to the principal repayment plan. Okay, they cannot defer that. That is not free from the point of view of the common stockholder. That should go to the creditor. But what is available to the stockholder would be proceeds from new debt. That's why we add plus new debt. So to get free cash flow from equity, if we have an estimate of net income, is one, you add back depreciation and amortization because those are non-cash charges to convert net income into a cash flow. And then we deduct money or funds set aside for the investment policies, CAPEX, and working capital needs. Then we deduct funds set aside for financing policies, preferred dividends, and principal repayments. But we can add proceeds from new debt because that is now available to the common shareholder. So where is interest here? Actually, interest expense has already been deducted. Why? We're using net income, and net income is net of interest expense already. What is left would be the free cash flow to equity shareholders. And most of the time, that is greater than the dividends that is actually declared by companies. So in our seat work later, we'll look at some problems wherein we have to consider both dividends and free cash flow to equity to determine the intrinsic price of the company we're analyzing, or the shares of the company we're analyzing in the seat work. Okay. Now, let's say there's no stable dividend policy. And there's another consideration. The company as changing leverage. Okay? We can have an alternative wherein we use the free cash flow to firm. Okay. So when we say free cash flow to firm, this is less likely to be negative compared to the free cash flow to equity. So what do you mean when we say free cash flow to firm? Okay. It is free from the point of view of the sources of financing. Free from the point of view of the shareholder and the creditor. Okay? So when it is free from the point of view of the shareholder and creditor, what is not free from that perspective? What is not free would be those that consider the investment or investing policies and plans. CapEx, capital expenditures, and working capital. So you have to deduct both to get the free cash flow to firm. But here, you have to isolate the effect of any payments to, and also any receipt coming from your creditor and shareholder. So free cash flow to firm considers the operating income, earnings before interest and taxes, net of tax. So it should exclude the effect of interest expense, because interest expense interest would go to the creditor. We're looking at cash flows that are free from the perspective of the creditor and the shareholder. Okay? So we exclude the effect of financing. Okay. So the first adjustment is we only consider operating income net of tax. We still add back depreciation and amortization to convert it into a cash flow, but we only have to deduct capital expenditures and working capital needs because those are not free. Those should go to the investment plans of the company. Okay. Financing is not yet considered. So that is free cash flow to firm. Okay. So let's say you have your free cash flow to equity. How do you determine your free cash flow to firm? Okay. From free cash flow to equity, you have to deduct interest expense net of tax. Okay. Sorry, not deduct, but add back. You have to add back interest expense net of tax. Again, we don't consider financing first. Remember, in your free cash flow to equity, you have already deducted interest expense net of tax, since that already is considered in your net income. You have to add it back so that it is free from the effect of financing. You add back preferred dividends, add back principal repayments, and deduct proceeds from your debt. That is if you want to reconcile free cash flow to equity to free cash flow to firm. Now, if you have your free cash flow to firm, you can apply the growth phases that we discussed. But now, the only difference is that you have to use the weighted average cost of capital. A cost of capital that considers creditors and shareholders as your discount rate. So when you get that intrinsic value, that is not yet the value of equity. We call that the firm value. So but our objective is to get the value of equity. So how do we get the value of equity? We deduct the value of debt to arrive at the value of equity. So we use WACC to get firm value and deduct the market value of debt to get the value of equity. Then you can divide it by the number of shares to get the intrinsic price per share. Okay. Let's go back to our free cash flow to firm formula. So if this is operating income net of tax plus depreciation, okay, when we say investment policies, your investment policies can be divided into two, okay, but both you have to deduct. Your investments could represent replacement investments, and growth investments. Okay? And usually, your replacement investment is equal to the depreciation of your existing assets. Okay? So sometimes we net out depreciation and replacement investment such that we deduct only growth investments. Okay? But to be sure, you add back depreciation and then you deduct both replacement investments and growth investments, your total capex, or total capital expenditures. Okay? And don't forget any additional working capital needs of the company. So to summarize, the free cash flow to firm would first give you the intrinsic value of the firm. That's the present value of your free cash flows. That is not the equity value. Deduct value of debt to determine the value of equity. And only then can you divide it by the number of shares. Firm value cannot be divided by share. Okay? Because creditors don't have shares. It is only the it's only the shareholders, particularly here, we're looking at the value of a common share, wherein you represent ownership in terms of shares. But to compute for enterprise value, let's say using the Modoran's formula, this is simply the sum of the market value of equity plus the market value of debt, minus or less the cash holdings of the company. We will explain that later. So the enterprise value can be thought of as the effective cost of buying a company. So this is the theoretical price of a target company. So the EV is the cost of buying the right to the whole of an entity's or an enterprise core cash flows. It is equal to the estimated value of the operations of an enterprise. We have an estimate of the value of the operations of an enterprise when we determine the enterprise value. And this is represented by the various claims on the cash flows. In the Modoran's formula, these various claims is represented by the market value of equity and the market value of debt. We can have a more detailed formula showing the various claims. Okay. So in DataStream, for example, if you use the enterprise value stated in DataStream, DataStream computes for enterprise value based on this formula. It is market capitalization at fiscal year end, the market value of equity, plus preferred stock, plus minority interest, plus total debt. Those are the different claims to the company's assets. Okay. Minus cash. Cash here represents cash and short-term investments, which may include some marketable securities, commercial paper, and money market funds. Why do we subtract this amount from enterprise value? This amount is subtracted because it will reduce the acquiring cost of the target company. It is assumed that the acquirer will use the cash immediately to pay off a portion of the theoretical takeover price. Specifically, it could be used immediately to pay a dividend or to buy back debt. As if we're saying we're buying the company using cash, but we're also getting cash. So why not simply deduct it? So here, cash is deducted because of that reason, plus the reason that it could be used to simply buy back debt. So the enterprise value here, again, are the different claims: market value of equity or market capitalization, preferred stock, minority interest, total debt, less cash holdings or cash and short-term investments. Now, some of you may be asking, is enterprise value the same as firm value? Because if you look at this formula, this is somewhat familiar. So there's a question whether Is this the same as firm value? Especially that firm value and enterprise value are most of the time used interchangeably. To um, to shed light on that question, whether it is equal to firm value or not, let's look at an article. I included a link to this article in our slides, but let me just highlight 3 illustrations included in the article. Okay? So what are these? Okay. One, we have here an illustration of the market value of the balance sheet. Okay, a market value balance sheet is represented by the market value of its assets divided into 2, cash and other non-operating assets plus the operating assets, which includes fixed assets plus intangibles plus working capital. On the right-hand side, we have the market value of debt and equity. Now, what is the market value of equity? To get the market value of equity, we deduct from the market value of assets the market value of debt. How do we distinguish that from firm value? Firm value is actually the sum of the market value of all the assets. Or, by looking at the right-hand side, it is the sum of the firm value of debt and the firm value of equity. Oh, sorry, the market value of debt and the market value of equity. If there are other claims, preferred stock, for example, and those that we mentioned earlier, those are also included in firm value. But how about enterprise value? Enterprise value here is debt plus equity or firm value minus cash and other non-operating assets. So meaning enterprise value then is the market value of operating assets. It's the market value again of the operating assets, which include fixed assets, intangibles, plus working capital. Okay? So let's go back to our slides. Based on that article, which you could also use using this, you could also view using this link, enterprise value is different from firm value. Okay. But just be careful with the terminologies. Remember the free cash flow to firm formula we used last time? How do we again compute for the free cash flow to firm? We use operating income or EBIT net of tax, okay, as our basis in the formula for free cash flow to firm with some adjustments, okay? So which means that when we use operating income as our main basis for free cash flow to firm, the present value that we're getting is actually the present value of operating assets. So what we're exactly referring to when we get the present value of free cash flow to firm is the present value of operating assets, which is the present value of the enterprise, which we also call as the enterprise value. To be strict about it, when we use the discussion of Professor Damodaran in the article, okay, the enterprise value then is not equal to the firm value. So what we're referring to in our formula last time is actually the enterprise value. So how do we then compute for the equity value? Remember, that's our objective. When we use the free cash flow to firm model, we still want to get the intrinsic price of a share of common stock. Okay. So meaning to get equity value, we deduct from enterprise value what? We deduct preferred stock, minority interest, market value of debt, but we need to add back cash. Okay, again, we arrive at the present value. That's the present value of operating assets. That is equal to the enterprise value. So from the enterprise value, how do we arrive at the equity value? We have to deduct preferred stock, minority interest, and debt, the market value of debt. But we have to add back cash and cash equivalents, okay, to arrive at the market value of equity. Okay. Now, as a rule of thumb, we simply deduct the entire cash and cash equivalents of the company. But if you read through the article, to be strict about it, what we need to add is cash, okay? But we need to add back is not just cash, but also other non-operating assets. But it's hard to identify other non-operating assets. So we simply assume that we add back cash to get the value or market value of equity. Okay. In the article also, you would see that what we account for as changes in working capital, to be strict about it, you have to include the changes in operating cash. So there, you have to distinguish between operating cash and non-operating cash. That is not an easy method to do, okay? So what we simply assume, the rule of thumb, is that when we account for the changes in working capital, we don't include cash. And when we add back cash to get the market value of equity coming from enterprise value, okay, we add back the entire cash balance or the entire cash holdings. If the cash balance is provided, before we arrive at the market value of equity, we have to add back cash, okay, and deduct the other claims, preferred stock, minority interest, total debt, to get the market value of equity. So just be careful with